In the heart of the Dakota Territory, in the brutal winter of 1878, the settlement of Providence Crossing was slowly starving. It was not a starvation of the belly, not yet, but a starvation of progress, a throttling of hope. The source of this slow strangulation was the very thing that gave the town its name, the formidable, treacherous expanse of the Absaroka River. In summer, the river was their lifeline, a churning artery of commerce plied by a single, overworked ferry. But in winter, it became a killer. The river froze, but it never truly slept. Beneath a sheet of ice that looked as solid as granite, a powerful current still flowed, a relentless liquid heart that scoured the underside of the freeze, creating invisible thin spots and deadly traps. Every winter was a gamble, a tense negotiation with the cold. The town would wait, watching the ice thicken, measuring it, tapping it, praying over it. When it was deemed thick enough, a crude bridge of logs and packed snow would be laid across the narrowest point, a fragile thread connecting them to the railhead and the world beyond. And every winter, the river claimed its price. Last year it was a team of oxen and a wagon load of milled flour, gone in a shatter of ice and a plume of freezing water. The year before, it was 3 tons of seed grain. This year, just last week, it had been Mr. Abernathy's new cast-iron stove, a symbol of warmth and prosperity that now sat in a silt at the bottom of the river, a cold monument to the town's predicament. The driver had barely scrambled to safety, his face a mask of white shock, his words frozen in his throat. The town needed timber from the South Bank to build the new church. It needed blasting powder for the spring quarrying. It needed the very sinews of its own survival, and they were all sitting on the wrong side of a frozen monster. The consensus, voiced grimly by the town elders in the warmth of the general store, was to wait. Wait for the legendary cold, the deep, windless freeze that might, if they were lucky, tame the river for a few precious weeks. But waiting was a luxury they could no longer afford. It was in this atmosphere of cold, quiet desperation that a single man began to do something that, to the rest of Providence Crossing, looked like pure, unadulterated madness. His name was Isaac. He was a quiet man, a former shipwright from the Great Lakes who had come west for the clean air and the promise of land. He rarely spoke at town meetings. He kept to himself. But he was always watching. He watched the way the ice buckled near the banks. He watched the patterns of the snowdrifts that spoke of the wind's unseen architecture. And most of all, he watched the water. He saw it not as a solid enemy, but as a living, breathing thing. While the town leaders debated the merits of waiting versus risking another conventional log crossing, Isaac was down at the riverbank with an auger and a measuring line. He wasn't just measuring thickness. He was listening. He was observing the way the ice sagged under his weight, the way the water level in his auger holes responded to pressure. He was treating the river ice not as a bridge, but as a hull. And then he began to build. He didn't cut a path. He didn't lay logs side by side. He started hauling massive 100-foot pine logs, behemoths he'd felled himself months earlier, down to the river's edge. He was building something enormous, a structure of immense weight, and he was building it directly on top of the very ice that had just swallowed a half-ton stove. He was adding weight to weakness. He was piling folly upon danger. The town looked on, and in the bitter, unforgiving cold, they saw not an innovator, but a fool courting a very public and very final disaster. They couldn't understand why he was building a second, heavier bridge on a frozen bridge that was already failing. Why was this quiet man planning to build a bridge on top of the very ice that had just failed? Why add weight to weakness? The town thought him a fool. They would soon learn he was a genius. The principles he was about to demonstrate were as old as water itself, yet forgotten by men who only knew how to build on solid ground. This story is about more than just a bridge. It's about a different way of seeing the world, a way of understanding that sometimes the greatest strength is found in learning how to yield. If you've ever felt the frustration of seeing a simple solution that no one else can grasp, hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe, because the secret behind Isaac's impossible bridge is a lesson in engineering that has been all but lost to time. We're going to break down exactly how he did it. Let us know in the comments, what's the most daring piece of improvised engineering you've ever witnessed? For many in Providence Crossing, this was the first and the last they would ever need to see. They were about to learn that the laws of the land did not apply to the kingdom of the river. To understand the radical nature of Isaac's plan, you first have to understand the man himself. Isaac was not a bridge builder. He was not a civil engineer trained in the academies of the East. He was a shipwright. For 20 years he had lived and breathed the language of wood and water on the shores of Lake Erie. His hands, calloused and scarred, knew the difference between the rigid strength of white oak and the flexible resilience of pine. He had spent his life building vessels designed to carry immense weight not on solid ground, but on a yielding, fluid surface. A ship, he knew, was a miracle of distributed load. Its hull, a carefully sculpted shell, displaced a volume of water. The weight of that displaced water, in a constant, invisible act of physics, pushed back up, creating a buoyant force that held the vessel afloat. Archimedes' principle was not an abstract concept to Isaac. It was the daily bread of his craft. He understood, in his bones, that you could place 1,000 tons of iron and timber on the surface of the water so long as you shaped it correctly. The water didn't care about the weight itself. It cared about the pressure, the weight per unit of area. When he looked at the Absaroka River, he didn't see a solid plate of ice. He saw the skin of the water. He saw a vast, continuous hull, already built and floating, courtesy of nature. The town's problem, he reasoned, was that they treated this skin like it was stone. They placed the narrow, hard feet of a wagon wheel or the sharp ends of a log directly onto it. This was a point load. All the weight, hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds, was concentrated into a few square inches. The ice, for all its apparent strength, had poor tensile capacity. It could be compressed, but it could not stretch. Under a point load, it would bend, stretch to its limit, and then fail catastrophically. It would shatter like glass. The town's solution was to make the glass thicker, to wait for the ice to grow to a depth where its sheer mass could resist the focused pressure. But the river's current made this a fool's errand. The thickness was never uniform. An area that was 3 feet thick could be right next to a patch scoured to less than a foot. Crossing was a game of Russian roulette. Isaac's mind, trained in the ways of ships, saw a different path. Don't fight the nature of the ice, he thought. Work with it. The ice was already floating. It was already a vessel. The key was not to puncture its hull. The key was to spread the load so gently over such a vast area that the ice would barely feel it. He wasn't building a bridge on the ice. He was building a raft, a massive sled that would use the ice sheet itself as an extension of its own hull. He began to construct his vision. The 2 enormous pine logs, each nearly 100 feet long and 3 feet in diameter, were the foundation. He had spent a week with an adze and a broadaxe, hewing their undersides into long, shallow curves, like the runners of a gargantuan sleigh. These were his load distributors. They would not sit on the ice, they would rest upon it, their immense surface area ensuring that the weight they carried would be spread out, transformed from a piercing point into a gentle, uniform pressure. Between these 2 great runners, he began to build a lattice. He laid heavy cross members every 4 feet, notching them expertly into the main runners. On top of this, he spiked down a deck of thick, rough-sawn 3-inch planks, leaving small gaps between them. The structure began to take shape, looking less like a bridge and more like a section of railroad track built by giants. It was over 12 feet wide and nearly 100 feet long. The town watched, their skepticism curdling into open mockery. They called it Isaac's Folly. They called him the River Fool. Marcus Thorne, the town's most respected builder, a man who had constructed every barn and house in Providence Crossing, was the most vocal critic. He was a master of post and beam construction, a man who understood the unyielding logic of vertical loads and solid foundations. He saw Isaac's creation as a violation of every principle he held dear. "The man is a danger to himself and others," Marcus declared one evening, holding court at the general store. The pot-bellied stove glowed red, but his words were colder than the air outside. "He's adding 10, maybe 15 tons of timber onto ice that can barely hold a wagon. It is the simplest law of nature. Ice is brittle. You add weight, it breaks. He's building a death trap." The men around the stove nodded in agreement. They understood Marcus's logic. It was the logic of the land, solid upon solid. But Isaac was using the logic of the sea. The final step in Isaac's plan was the one that cemented his reputation as a madman. Once the wooden structure was complete, he organized a bucket brigade. For 2 days, he and his 2 teenage sons hauled water from holes chopped in the ice and poured it systematically over the entire bridge. The water filled the gaps between the planks, seeped into the notches and joints, and cascaded over the giant runners. In the sub-zero air, it froze almost instantly. He was deliberately adding hundreds, then thousands of pounds of extra weight to his structure. But he wasn't just adding weight. He was performing a kind of frontier alchemy. He was creating a composite material. The wood, with its high tensile strength, acted like reinforcing bars. The ice, with its immense compressive strength, acted like concrete. He was fusing the bridge and the river into a single, monolithic structure. He had built a beam of ice and wood, 100 feet long and several feet thick, far stronger than either material on its own. The bridge was no longer sitting on the ice. It was now a part of the ice, a massive, integrated reinforcement. When he was finished, the structure was a formidable sight. It gleamed under the winter sun, a solid, seamless ribbon of wood and ice. It had settled slightly, the immense weight causing the main ice sheet beneath it to sag. Along its entire length, a thin film of water had welled up from cracks, creating a shallow, visible depression. To the townspeople, this was the final proof of his insanity. The bridge was so heavy it was already sinking. It was a failure before it was even tested. Isaac saw it differently. He looked at the water welling along the edges, and he smiled. It was not a sign of failure. It was the sign of success. It was the physical manifestation of Archimedes' principle. The bridge had depressed the ice, displacing a massive volume of water beneath it. That displaced water was now pushing back, supporting the bridge from below. The river itself had become the foundation. He had not built a bridge. He had built a ship, and it was ready to sail. The social rejection was as bitter and biting as the winter wind. In a small, isolated community like Providence Crossing, conformity was a form of survival. Trusting your neighbors, adhering to established wisdom, these were not just social graces. They were essential strategies for staying alive in a harsh environment. Isaac, with his strange ideas and his quiet refusal to explain them in terms the townsfolk could understand, had placed himself outside that circle of trust. His project, Isaac's Folly, became the town's primary form of winter entertainment. Men would gather on the riverbank, their breath pluming in the frigid air, and offer running commentary on his progress. They made bets on which day it would collapse under its own weight. "See that?" one would say, pointing. "The whole thing's listing to the east. It'll go before Sunday." Another would chime in. "Heard from my boy he's pouring water on it now, trying to sink it before the river does the job for him." The ridicule was not confined to the riverbank. It followed him through the town like a stray dog. At the general store, conversations would halt when he entered, resuming in hushed, pointed whispers the moment he was occupied with his purchases. Children, with the casual cruelty of their age, invented a skipping rhyme. Isaac, Isaac, the river fool, built a bridge that's bound to drool, down to the bottom, cold and deep, where the fishes watch him weep. He would walk past them, his face impassive, his gaze fixed on some distant point, never letting on that he heard. But the sharpest barbs came from the man whose opinion carried the most weight. Marcus Thorne saw Isaac's project not just as foolish, but as a personal and professional affront. Marcus was the authority on building in Providence Crossing. His word was law on matters of timber, stress, and load. He had built the ferry dock, the town hall, and the granary, all stout, reliable structures that followed the time-honored rules of his craft. He dealt in plumb bobs and spirit levels, in the certainty of right angles and the predictable strength of a well-made mortise and tenon joint. Isaac's bridge, with its talk of buoyancy and flex, was an alien language. It seemed to mock the very foundations of Marcus's knowledge. He took it upon himself to warn the community, to frame Isaac's work as a public menace. He confronted Isaac one afternoon, finding him checking the frozen joints of his nearly completed structure. "Isaac," Marcus began, his voice devoid of warmth. "This has gone on long enough. You must stop this. You're creating a hazard." Isaac straightened up slowly, wiping his mittened hand across his brow. He looked at Marcus, his eyes calm. "It's almost finished, Marcus." "Finished?" Marcus scoffed, gesturing at the immense, gleaming structure. "It was finished the moment you laid the first log on this ice. This is not land. This is a crust of frozen water over a moving current. You cannot apply the principles of the shipyard here. You are piling weight upon weakness. I have calculated the load of this timber. I have measured the thickness of the ice. By every law of engineering I know, this structure should have already collapsed. The fact that it hasn't is a fluke of temperature, nothing more." "The laws are sound," Isaac said quietly. "You're just applying them to the wrong foundation. The foundation isn't the ice. It's the water." Marcus shook his head, a look of profound pity and frustration on his face. "You are deluded. You speak in riddles. I am telling you, as the man who builds for this town, that if anyone attempts to cross this thing, they will die. I will not have that on my conscience. I will state for the record at the next town meeting that this bridge is unsafe and should be dismantled." "The bridge will have its say," Isaac replied, turning back to his work. "And so will the river." The confrontation left Marcus seething, and Isaac unshaken. But the social pressure was taking its toll elsewhere. The hardest part for Isaac was not the public scorn, but the worry he saw etched on his wife's face. Sarah was a practical woman, born and raised on the frontier. She believed in her husband's skill, had seen the masterful work he could do with wood. But she was also a part of the community. She heard the whispers at the quilting circle, saw the pitying looks from other women at the store. One evening, as Isaac sat by the fire, oiling his tools, she finally spoke the words that had been weighing on her for weeks. "Isaac," she began, her voice soft but strained. "Mr. Henderson stopped me today. He was concerned. He said Marcus Thorne is going to demand the town marshal forbid anyone from using the bridge." Isaac continued his work, rubbing linseed oil into the handle of a draw knife. "That's Marcus's right." "But is he right?" she pressed, her hands twisting in her apron. The whole town thinks you've lost your senses. They say the bridge is already sinking. They laugh at you. At us. I don't care about the laughter, Isaac, not really. But what if they're right? What if all your knowledge of boats and lakes doesn't apply here? What if you've made a terrible mistake? Her voice trembled on the last words. What if someone gets hurt? This was the one attack that could pierce his calm resolve. He set his tool down and looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, weary affection. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and steady. "Do you remember the sea serpent?" She nodded. It was the last vessel he had helped build on Lake Erie, a massive 6-masted schooner designed to carry iron ore. It was bigger and heavier than any wooden ship they had ever built. Everyone said she was too big, Isaac continued. Too heavy. The old masters said her back would break in the first storm. They used their old rules for smaller ships. But the designer, he understood the new rules. He understood how to distribute the frame, how to brace the hull. He knew the water would hold her if she was built right. When we launched her, she sat lower in the water than any ship before. The old masters pointed and said, "See, she's sinking already." They didn't understand. She wasn't sinking. She was finding her balance. She was letting the water hold her. He reached out and took her hand. "This bridge is the sea serpent. Everyone here is an old master, looking at it with old rules. They see it sinking. I see it finding its balance. I am not wrong. The wood and the water and the cold, they are all working together exactly as I knew they would. All we have to do now is wait for the test." His certainty was a comfort, a small island of calm in a sea of public doubt. Sarah squeezed his hand, her fear subsiding, replaced by a fragile trust. But outside their small cabin, the town remained convinced that Isaac, the quiet shipwright, was building his own tombstone, and that the coming test would be his funeral. He did not argue. He did not defend himself in the public square. He simply finished his work, shoveled a clear path to the entrance of his bridge, and waited. He had an unshakable faith not in himself, but in the principles he had spent a lifetime mastering. His resolve was as solid and as cold as the ice itself. The test came sooner, and in a more dramatic fashion than anyone could have possibly imagined. It arrived not as a simple wagon load of lumber, but as a crisis that held the entire future of Providence Crossing in its cold, iron grip. The new steam engine for the town's sawmill, the machine that was meant to usher in an era of prosperity, had arrived. It sat on a reinforced flat car at the railhead on the far side of the river, a 10-ton behemoth of cast iron, brass, and steel. The sawmill was the town's single greatest investment, a collective enterprise funded by every family. The engine was its heart. Without it, the vast stands of timber in the surrounding hills were worthless. With it, they could produce finished lumber, build better houses, and export their wealth to the world. The engine's arrival should have been a cause for celebration. Instead, it was a catastrophe. It was too heavy. Far too heavy for any conventional ice crossing Marcus Thorne could devise. He estimated they would need a solid 4 feet of clear, black ice to even consider moving such a weight, and the river was offering barely 2. To compound the crisis, a telegraph arrived from the freight company with an ultimatum. The engine had to be unloaded within 3 days. A massive blizzard, a true Siberian express, was churning down from Canada. The railroad had to clear its lines. If the engine wasn't offloaded, it would be taken to the next territory, 100 miles west, and the town would have to wait until the spring thaw to try and retrieve it, at a ruinous cost. Panic set in. A grim town meeting was held. The air in the small hall was thick with despair. Marcus Thorne stood before the assembled families, his face grim. "It's impossible," he stated flatly. I cannot, in good conscience, sanction any attempt to cross this ice with that load. The risk is absolute. The engine will be lost, and likely men and horses with it. We have to let it go. We will have to wait for the ferry in May." A groan of collective anguish filled the room. Waiting until May meant a lost season, a year of stagnation and debt. It was a devastating blow. The dream of progress was freezing to death right alongside the river. Then, from the back of the room, a quiet voice spoke. "My bridge will hold it." Every head turned. Isaac stood near the door, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Disbelief, scorn. A few desperate faces showed a flicker of hope. Marcus Thorne turned, his face flushing with anger. "Do not speak of that monstrosity here, Isaac. We are discussing a matter of life and death, not your riverside fantasy. 10 tons. That is 20,000 pounds. Your folly would shatter like a window pane. The bridge is over 1,200 square feet in surface area on its runners," Isaac replied, his voice calm and even, cutting through the noise. "The load of the engine, spread across that area, will be less than 17 pounds per square foot. The pressure exerted by a single man standing still is more than 200 pounds per square foot. The bridge will not fail." He was speaking the language of physics, of pressure and distribution. But to the townspeople, it was just numbers. What they saw was one man, the expert they trusted, declaring it impossible, and another, the fool they had mocked for weeks, making an outrageous claim. But they were desperate. Mayor Henderson, a man whose pragmatism outweighed his skepticism, saw the town's only slim chance. "Isaac," he said, his voice heavy with doubt, "if you are wrong, if that engine goes into the river, the town is ruined, and the freight company will hold us liable." "It will not fail," Isaac repeated. There was no boast in his voice. It was a statement of fact. And so, with no other options, the town council agreed. The fate of Providence Crossing would rest upon Isaac's folly. The next morning dawned painfully bright and brutally cold. The entire town gathered on the near bank of the river, a dark, huddled mass against the white snow. The air was perfectly still and so cold it hurt to breathe. On the far side, the massive engine had been carefully winched off the flat car and onto a heavy sled, its black iron bulk looking impossibly dense and heavy. A team of 16 massive draft horses, their breath crystallizing in the air, was hitched to the sled. The plan was for the horses to pull the sled to the very edge of the bridge. They would then be unhitched, and a system of ropes and capstans, manned by teams of men on the home bank, would slowly pull the sled across. No one wanted to risk the concentrated weight of the horses on the bridge itself. The horses strained, their muscles bunching, and the sled began to move, its runners groaning against the snow. It reached the entrance to Isaac's bridge and stopped. The moment of truth had arrived. The crowd fell silent. Every eye was fixed on the scene. Isaac walked onto the bridge alone. He paced its length, his boots making soft crunching sounds. He knelt, placing a bare hand on the icy surface, as if listening. He walked back to the entrance and gave a single, sharp nod. The men at the capstans took up the slack. The ropes went taut. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, the front runners of the sled slid from the snowy bank onto the wooden planks of the bridge. A collective gasp went through the crowd. A deep, resonant groan echoed across the river, a sound like the earth itself complaining. It was the sound of the ice sheet bending under the sudden, immense load. The bridge, which had sat level, began to visibly sink. It settled a good 6 inches, maybe more. Water, black and ominous, began to well up all along the edges of the 100-foot runners, filling the depression and creating a dark, liquid border around the entire structure. "It's going!" someone screamed from the crowd. A wave of panic rippled through the onlookers. Marcus Thorne stood at the very front, his arms crossed, his face a mask of grim, vindicated certainty. This was it. The catastrophic failure he had predicted. He watched the ice sag, watched the water pool, and waited for the sickening crack and roar as the whole thing gave way. He was ready to organize the rescue, to pull the foolish and the dead from the freezing water, but the crack never came. The groaning subsided, replaced by an eerie creaking. The bridge settled, and then it held. It floated, stable and secure, in its self-made channel of water, a massive artificial island of wood and ice. The front of the sled was on, and the bridge was holding the weight. Isaac, still standing on the bank, gave another nod. The men at the capstans, their faces pale with terror and adrenaline, began to turn the handles again. The sled inched forward, its entire 20,000-pound load now fully on the bridge. The structure sank another inch, displaced more water, and then stabilized again. It was working. The impossible was happening. Marcus Thorne stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. He saw the water. He saw the depression. And in a dizzying, sickening flash of insight, the shipwright's words came back to him. The foundation isn't the ice. It's the water. He had been thinking of a solid beam breaking under a load, but this wasn't a beam. It was a boat. Isaac had built a boat. A long, flat, crude boat made of wood and ice, and the river was holding it up, just as the sea holds a ship. The sinking wasn't failure. It was displacement. It was buoyancy. It was the very proof that the principle was sound. He felt a profound intellectual vertigo. His entire world of solid, dependable certainties had been upended. He was a master of building on the land, but this man, this quiet fool, was a master of building on the water. And he had understood that a frozen river was still, in its heart, the water. Slowly, steadily, the sled glided across the gleaming surface of the bridge. The creaks and groans continued, the sound of the structure adjusting to the moving load. But it was the sound of a living thing adapting, not a dying thing breaking. Midway across, a pressure ridge in the main ice sheet gave way with a loud crack like a rifle shot, sending a spiderweb of fractures across the river surface, 20 yards from the bridge. The crowd cried out in fear, but the bridge itself, a monolithic beam, absorbed the shock. It distributed the energy. It was an island of stability in the midst of chaos. When the sled's runners finally touched the solid ground of the home bank, a stunned silence held for a moment. And then the crowd erupted. A wild, disbelieving cheer went up, a raw explosion of relief and amazement. They had not just saved their engine, they had witnessed a miracle. They swarmed around Isaac, clapping him on the back, shaking his hand, their previous mockery forgotten in the face of his stunning, undeniable success. Isaac simply nodded, a small, tired smile on his face, and watched as the men secured the precious engine on solid ground. His bridge and the river had spoken, and everyone had heard. The triumph of the crossing was absolute. But Isaac's vindication was not yet complete. It was one thing to see a miracle. It was another thing to understand it. The day after the engine was safely installed in the new sawmill, Isaac was back down at the river, this time accompanied by a single, humbled man. Marcus Thorne. Marcus had approached him that morning, his hat in his hands, his face etched with the humility of a man forced to confront the limits of his own knowledge. "Isaac," he had said, his voice quiet, "I was wrong. I was profoundly and publicly wrong. I ask your forgiveness. But more than that, I ask you to teach me. I must understand the numbers behind what I saw." And so, they went to the bridge. They brought with them a surveyor's chain, a heavy steel scale, and Isaac's auger. There in the biting cold, they performed the first formal, data-driven analysis of the floating ice bridge. First, they calculated the weight of the bridge itself. By measuring the displacement of the logs and planks and knowing the density of pine and ice, they arrived at a figure of approximately 16 tons. The steam engine on its sled was 10 tons. The total load on the ice sheet was a staggering 26 tons, or 52,000 pounds. Next, they measured the precise surface area of the two great runners that were in contact with the ice. The area was 1,250 square feet. A simple division gave them the answer. The total pressure exerted on the ice sheet by the bridge and its cargo was 41.6 pounds per square foot. Then came the crucial comparison. Marcus, a stout man of 200 pounds, stood on the ice away from the bridge. The soles of his boots had a combined area of roughly 3/4 of a square foot. The pressure he was exerting on the ice at that moment was over 260 pounds per square foot. The numbers laid the truth bare, stripping it of all emotion and opinion. The bridge, with its 10-ton cargo, was putting less than 1/6 the pressure on the ice than a single standing man. The final piece of the puzzle was the displacement. They drilled holes through the ice at a distance from the bridge and measured the water level. Then they drilled holes right beside the runners, inside the depression channel. The water level there was nearly 8 inches higher. Isaac explained the calculation. The volume of the displaced water, multiplied by its weight, was pushing up with a force of 52,000 pounds. The math was perfect. The system was in equilibrium. Archimedes' principle, rendered in wood and ice on the Dakota frontier. Marcus stared at the figures in his notebook, shaking his head in wonder. "You didn't build on the ice at all," he said, finally grasping the full scope of Isaac's genius. "You used the ice as a tool to build a foundation on the river itself. It's the most brilliant piece of engineering I have ever seen." That evening, at a hastily called town meeting to celebrate the sawmill engine, Marcus Thorne stood before the same people he had warned against Isaac's folly. His voice was strong and clear. "I have 2 things to say tonight," he began. "The first is that our town owes its future to the vision of one man. The second is that for the past month, I have been a fool." He went on to publicly apologize to Isaac. But he didn't stop there. Using his own authority as the town's expert builder, he explained the principles to the crowd. He used simple analogies they could understand. He described the bridge as a great snowshoe, spreading the weight of a giant. He called it a boat, floating in its own small harbor. He broke down the numbers, explaining how gentle the pressure was, how safe the design had been all along. He gave Isaac's creation a name, one that would stick. From this day forward, he declared, that design should be known by its proper name, the Shipwrights Bridge. The community's adoption of the new technology was immediate and universal. The shame of their mockery was replaced by a fervent desire to learn. That winter, under Isaac's quiet guidance and Marcus's enthusiastic project management, the men of Providence Crossing built 2 more Shipwrights Bridges at key crossing points along the river. Commerce, which had always frozen with the water, now flowed freely all winter long. The town boomed. The sawmill, powered by its new engine, churned out lumber at an incredible rate. Word of the incredible 10-ton crossing spread. Settlers and engineers from other river towns came to see the bridges, to copy the design. The principle of the floating, load-distributing ice bridge became a piece of essential frontier knowledge, a technique passed from one settlement to the next. It saved countless tons of cargo, and more importantly, it saved lives. No longer did men have to risk everything on a thin, unpredictable sheet of ice. The shipwright's bridge transformed the most dangerous feature of the landscape into the most reliable. Its legacy extended far beyond the 19th century. The core principles Isaac demonstrated, load distribution, buoyancy on an ice sheet, and the use of ice as a composite building material, are the very same principles that govern the construction of modern ice roads in the Arctic. These massive, carefully engineered roadways, capable of supporting the heaviest industrial trucks, are the direct descendants of Isaac's folly. They are a testament to a quiet genius who understood that true strength often comes not from rigid resistance, but from a deep, practical wisdom that knows how to work with the powerful forces of nature instead of against them. The bridge was more than a structure. It was a lesson in humility, a reminder that the world is full of hidden foundations, waiting for those with the vision to see them. The story of Isaac's bridge is a powerful lesson that resonates far beyond the 19th century frontier. It's a testament to the fact that revolutionary ideas are often born not from within a field of expertise, but from the outside. Isaac's background as a shipwright gave him a perspective that the land-based builders, for all their skill, could never possess. He saw a fluid, dynamic system where they saw a solid, static one. It's a crucial reminder that sometimes the greatest innovations come from applying the principles of one discipline to the problems of another. It's also a story about intellectual humility. Marcus Thorne was not a villain. He was a knowledgeable and respected expert, operating from a lifetime of successful experience. His error was not in his understanding of physics, but in his certainty that his understanding was complete. His ultimate redemption, and the mark of his true character, was his willingness to admit his error publicly and to learn from the very man he had ridiculed. This is the heart of all true progress, the ability to recognize a better idea even when it shatters our most cherished assumptions. Finally, Isaac's story champions the power of quiet observation and methodical persistence over loud, popular opinion. He never engaged in angry debates. He never tried to shout down his critics. He simply observed the problem, formulated a theory based on sound principles, and then did the work. He let the result be his argument. In a world saturated with noise and opinion, this is perhaps the most enduring lesson of all, that the most powerful statement is a successful demonstration. The bridge spoke for itself, and its message was undeniable. If this story of forgotten genius and practical wisdom has inspired you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next dive into the lost art of engineering. We believe these stories hold valuable lessons for the challenges we face today. We want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us, what modern engineering marvel do you think started as an idea that everyone thought was crazy? From skyscrapers to spacecraft, so many of the technologies we take for granted were once dismissed as impossible fantasies. Let's celebrate the innovators who refused to listen. Your engagement helps us keep these incredible stories alive. Disclaimer: this telling is a fictionalized account, intended for educational and entertainment purposes. The characters and specific events depicted are products of creative invention. However, the underlying engineering principles, load distribution, ice mechanics, buoyancy, and the use of composite materials, are based on real historical practices and established physics. The construction of ice bridges and winter roads was a genuine historical technique used in northern climates. Any attempt to replicate such a structure today would require professional engineering consultation and must comply with all modern safety standards, environmental regulations, and local laws. Do not attempt to build or cross any ice structure that has not been professionally certified as safe.